I'm here today with Wyatt Claypool for another fantastic BagelCast. So what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss several things, but we're going to start in with this article in the Cult MTL, a Montreal-based newspaper, about why the Conservatives want Trudeau to step down because they're scared. Dun dun dun.
Just shaking in their boots as we speak. I doubt Pure Polia can even get sleep these days.
So I'll just quickly summarize this first paragraph because the rest of the article is actually relatively short, but also kind of whatever. It's not really that relevant. So basically, he's saying that because in a Ledger poll that's out of date, though I think it wasn't out of date at the time of making this article, but anyways, it was kind of an outlier at the time, that Trudeau's approval rating was higher than the preferred prime minister selection for Poilievre. They want Trudeau to step down. The Conservatives want Trudeau to step down because then Trudeau is going to beat the Conservatives in an election. And this is the poll they're citing. So Poilievre has 26% in this poll as preferred prime minister. And up here you can see Trudeau has 29% support.
Or the Trudeau government.
Sorry, the Trudeau government has 29% satisfied. And you break this down, and it's like 74% of the Liberals, like 35% of the NDP, 22% of the Bloc, 25% Green, etc. Right?
And that's immediately, and also go back up there. This should immediately have red flags on the field for a lot of people when 9% of PPC voters are satisfied with the Trudeau government.
Yep, that really, well, especially considering you look at the sample size here. Like this is a sample size of 34. The margin of error on the PPC number here is going to be crazy. So like basically, this 9% is in margin of error probably like -3.
And it's effectively cheating because the question of do you approve of the government that has basically three parties involved in it, the Liberals, NDP, and the Bloc. Doesn't matter if these days Jagmeet Singh's pretending that he's no longer supporting the Liberal government through the supply and confidence agreement. All three of those parties have a lot invested in the current government, and then the Greens are pretty much in line with a lot of the priorities of the Liberals and the NDP. So there's 3 to 4 parties whose supporters have at least somewhat of a decent likelihood of saying that they are satisfied with the Trudeau government. Whereas when you go to the question of Pure Poilievre's like preferred prime minister ratings, well, there's really only one party who has a strong likelihood of saying that they prefer him, that being the Conservative Party, because you're asking about who would you prefer as the prime minister, and that means every party gets to, say the party I support, I'd prefer their leader be the prime minister, whereas the are you satisfied with the government question is more of like a practical question. Even if you didn't vote Liberal, generally do you feel like you're getting something out of it, which an NDP supporter could reasonably conclude, or a Bloc supporter could reasonably conclude. On preferred prime minister, most NDP people are going to pick Jagmeet Singh, most Liberals are going to pick Justin Trudeau, most Conservatives are going to pick Pure Poilievre, and it's silly.
And I think too, it's bad to compare these two particular questions. Are you ready for this? This is crazy. They're different questions. This is asking the best prime minister. This is asking satisfaction. You can be satisfied with the Trudeau government and think it's not the best government. You can be happy to vote for Poilievre and not think he's the best guy. There's a lot of people, for example, I actually know some personally, who probably will vote Conservative and probably will vote for Poilievre, who would rather, like, a Peter MacKay kind of guy running the Conservative Party. They'll still vote for Poilievre, but they don't think Poilievre's the best guy. And that's how you get people like 11% of the Conservatives saying none of the above. Because they don't like Poilievre, they're going to vote for him, because they hate everyone else more.
And as you pointed out before we went live, there are 3 answers in this particular question on best prime minister, which basically equals none of them. That either, prefer not to answer, don't know, none of the above. With the are you satisfied or not, it's yes or no, and I think technically some people can say they don't know.
There's preferred not to answer and don't know.
Yeah.
Which And that's only 6%. So 6% have no opinion on the government or don't want to
And
say
somebody else is a much stronger answer here. With none of the above. It's basically saying someone completely different, and that is what's going to be your I prefer Peter MacKay type choices, or I prefer Mark Carney type choices. But in the mind of the writer here, Matthew Renfrew at Cult MTL or Cult Montreal or whatever, he's comparing the best prime minister polling that still puts Poilievre ahead. Let's not forget that. Poilievre is still ahead of Justin Trudeau by 7 points on that question on this outlier poll. Most other polls I've seen usually put Pierre Poilievre above 30%, usually mid 30s. Justin Trudeau is usually around like 22%. So he's doing usually a little bit better than this poll. It's kind of a bit of an outlier. But he's thinking that now the Conservatives must be scared because the government satisfaction is 3% higher than people would prefer Pierre Poilievre be the prime minister. Government satisfaction should be around the 40s if you're a government that's going to hope to get reelected. It's like with Justin Trudeau's personal approval rating, or when you go down south to presidential or vice presidential approval ratings, you got to be, if you want a good chance of being reelected as the prime minister or president, you got to be in like mid to high 40s if you want a really clear shot. Mid 20s, wow, that's sad. That's really sad.
Yeah, and the thing with this too, like in Canada, it's very easy, especially on the left, for someone in the NDP to think, aha, I'm going to vote Singh. Singh's the best prime minister. He's the best guy. Woohoo, Singh. And then we'll look at Trudeau and be like, yeah, his government's fine. And that's one of the reasons why you see like Singh or Trudeau might have relatively high approval ratings here compared to, say, Poilievre. And a lot of times Singh for the longest time had really good approval ratings. And a lot of that's because a lot of Liberals would look at Singh and be like, oh yeah, Singh looks like a good guy. I'd totally back Singh. I like Trudeau more, but Singh, not a bad dude. And it's basically the same equivalent in the U.S. of people being like, I like Bernie Sanders, but, Biden's not bad. They can't vote for Bernie Sanders, so they vote for Biden. Or in this case, they might vote for Kamala Harris.
And we'll probably get into that a little bit later about kind of the wonkiness with Kamala Harris's approval rating and just the concept of response biases. But the one last thing I want to touch on with this Cult MTL article, and it has to do with the thing I was independently wanting to jump into. I just noticed that it actually does cue us up really well. So if you go back to the Cult MTL article, you'll see that on the third paragraph there, it reads, remember, there are these are the same people who have no clue how to defend themselves when people call them weird, because deep down they know that their anti-science narrative reliance on disinformation and lack of empathy is weird. And they're talking about conservatives, obviously. And on that disinformation point, I want to jump over to the Frank Graves Ecos polling, because this is one of the most obnoxious talking points against conservatives in Canada, that conservatives, and we see article headlines about this all the time, it's the exact same scuffed information reported on usually every quarter of the year, that conservatives are very likely to believe in misinformation and disinformation compared to other members of other parties. And a lot of this is just copium, both from Frank Graves and the people who believe in it, like Matthew Renfrew at Cult MTL, pretending that, well, we're only losing because our opponents are so stupid. At the same time, how do you think you're going to win calling a large portion of the population stupid? But I want to talk about why this disinformation polling that Ecos puts out is just worth less than nothing. It's just partisan hackery, and this is where generally the polling industry is quite good in Canada. This is the sort of area where the polling industry is horrible. Partisan questions or specifically policy questions, they can never do them right, and this is a prime example.
Yes, what we see here with this, so in this last Ecos poll, this is from August 19th, Frank Graves breaks this down into 5 different levels. And he's a vote distribution by the different levels. And it's like, oh, look, PPC conservatives are the most disinformed. Well, you might ask yourself, and this is a very important question, what is this number? Where do they get it? And we scroll down here. This is where we get it. So I'll zoom in so we can see it easily. So it's a 15-point scale based on how strongly you agree or disagree with these points. And it's Canada's economic growth lags behind the G7 average. Vaccine-related deaths are concealed from the public. More Canadians have died from COVID-19 than COVID-19 itself. Russia's committed war crimes in Ukraine. And climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. There's two big problems with this. First off, he has cherry-picked 5 things that people on the right, broadly, are more likely to believe. And nothing that the left might believe that is disinformation. As we discussed prior to the launching of this video, I pointed out that if you polled how many people has Israel mostly killed women and children in Gaza, it would likely get a lot of people on the left saying yes. And that would be fake. That'd be false. That'd be disinformation. And even in these questions themselves, they're worded in such a way to trick people who aren't really thinking very carefully. Because ECO's polls by telephone. If you're not listening very carefully on the telephone, or you're just slightly distracted, you could answer slightly wrong. For example, this first one. Canada's economic growth lags well behind the G7 average. This is phrased in a way to trick people, because a lot of conservatives, like Pierre Poilievre, their talking point is that Canada's per capita growth lags behind the G7 average, which is true. That is a true statement. But the overall growth does not. It's quite good, because the overall growth is padded by huge population growth that Canada's having.
Yeah, which means that you could import a trillion more people, and if they all have $1 in their pocket, we've technically added $1 trillion to the GDP. Even though if you took into account the effect on per capita income, obviously that would mean everyone now only makes about like $1.25.
Mm-hmm. And you could say the same thing with a lot of these things too. For example, this Russia has committed war crimes in Ukraine question. This is very easily responded to with a skip. Because they might not know. Because how many people look into that?
Also, it's just such a stupid way of doing a disinformation scale that you can technically say, oh, I agree with that or I disagree with that, but that still puts you on the scale of believing in misinformation, disinformation, because you didn't say, oh, I strongly agree with that or I strongly disagree with that, because it's padding the numbers by making it so that if a conservative person says that they strongly disagree with something that maybe technically is true, it really puts them down on the numbers in terms of how much disinformation they believe. Whereas a liberal who is going to strongly agree with the liberal talking point, that means that they don't believe in disinformation absolutely at all. So it's making sure you strike the conservative with a -2 on that scale, but the liberal gets a +2, rather than it just being true or not true.
And a good example of what I just said there is the climate change question here, because this is important. Is caused by is a very strong sentence. That's saying all of climate change is caused only by greenhouse gas emissions. That no other source has any impact at all. Is caused by. Very strong sentence. If you said mostly true, you get dinged points for being disinformed. Because you don't want to assert to this very strong claim that nothing else is impacting it. Which is a very bold thing, because no climate science actually says nothing else impacts it. I mean, just obviously, if you have a volcano erupt, that's going to impact the climate. I'm not sure what percentage of the climate, but that's going to do something.
And just things like how close is the Earth to the sun this year compared to last year and stuff like that, which changes a little bit. That obviously affects it. There's tons of anything on the planet technically affects the climate.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? You just randomly, like it's Gary's mod, and just spawned, 10 trillion donuts in the Congo or whatever, that would technically affect the climate.
Now, if this was a much and this is one of the problems with these questions, like the more accurate question for this, if you want to go by quote unquote normal climate science, is it should be climate change is driven by, which is a very looser word than caused. Caused leaves no other possible explanation. Driven by means that greenhouse gas emissions is the main problem.
Or a better question would be the increased rate of forest fires that we've had in the last 10 years compared to the previous 10 years has been caused by human created carbon carbon emissions. That would be more specific. That's something that someone could agree with or disagree with. Even that, obviously extremely dubious on whether that's true or not. And that's the problem with all of these questions, is it's really just the truth according to Frank Graves and Ecos. Mm-hmm. Again, you could say that the Canada's economy growth lags well behind the G7 is 100% true. It 100% is lagging behind the rest of the G7 because raw GDP, in a certain sense, probably shouldn't matter. It really is, what is the actual per capita productivity of your country, isn't it? And is it growing or not?
Yeah, and as I touched on in the beginning too, there is no corresponding things that left-wing people might believe. And there's plenty of left-wing disinformation that people believe. For example, that the rich pay no taxes. That's a thing you see left-wingers and progressives say all the time. It's not true. People, for example, you'll see people say Elon Musk pays less taxes and blah blah blah, and it's nope. He definitely pays the most taxes in the U.S. probably. There might be other billionaires who pay more.
Or ask people about what a grocery store's profit margin is. Grocery stores are making record profits. That's actual misinformation. They're just not. They are making more in raw revenue numbers, but in terms of profit, their profit margins have actually been going down. But if you're part of if you're a supporter of the NDP and you agree with a lot of the stuff that Jagmeet Singh says, you would assume that, yeah, they are making record profits because your party leader is saying so.
And that's really just the issue with a question like this in general. This is not me or Wyatt saying that we have to have this question be balanced. It's that this question is fundamentally flawed because the person asking it decides what questions you are included. Because there's a million different things you could classify as misinformation or disinformation. And the things you pick to put in the question, because you can't have every question. Because if you ask someone 30 questions, they're going to hang up the telephone. No one's going to answer that. That's ridiculous. So the ones you're selecting, you're curating, is going to bias whatever you're doing. And it's no longer an effective or meaningful poll. Meaningful data. And even if you manage to make a curated thing that is a reasonable approximation of a list, it's still also kind of dubious because what the fuck does this even mean? Pardon the swearing. Shouldn't be swearing on YouTube, but anyways, whatever. What does this mean?
If you're more than 5 minutes into a video, actually, I think they don't detect it.
Oh, that's good. Anyways, what does this mean? What does this do for anybody? Okay, let's say hypothetically Ecos is correct and conservative voters are more disinformed. What do we do with this information?
Oh, and really, it's just turned into cope. It's just turned into cope for a lot of more liberal-leaning legacy media outlets. That Justin Trudeau's really far down the polls, but look, Pierre Poilievre's base is made up of crazy people or something like that, and then they wonder why the left is having a really big problem reaching out to new voters when so much of their strategies rely on trying to mean girls the Conservative Party supporters into thinking oh, you guys are a bunch of losers, but you should try and hang out with us, the cool kids.
Yeah, and this kind of boils down to more broadly the entire in Canada liberal campaign strategy across not even just federally but the provinces too, in that they don't. No one in that party, the provincial parties, the federal parties, seem to really understand why they lose elections at all. You look at the federal party right now, they don't seem to have any sweet clue why they're polling 20-ish points behind just recently their campaign director quit because their campaign director was like, "Well, this is hopeless," and there's
Oh yeah, and
no
I
recollection.
guarantee he's probably. I guarantee he probably wasn't even the problem. It's that he probably couldn't do anything because when you're working for people who are, in a certain sense, delusional, at some point you're probably going to go save your own reputation by leaving because they believe that every time you probably suggest completely pivoting or changing tactics, they're going to be like, well, why? We're right though. And it's like, well, the problem is you're not. And even from a purely relativistic perspective, at least the voters think that you're wrong. And you're not going to be able to convince them that they're wrong for feeling this way when they felt this way for years.
Mm.
And this is actually happening in British Columbia right now, since I'm in BC helping the BC Conservative Party. You'll see BC NDP MLAs running for re-election. The several that are still trying to run for re-election because a lot of them are quitting because they just don't like working for David Eby. But that's another point for another day. But they will actively retweet conservatives on X and attack them for like climate change denial or something like that. This is a big new push they're doing against John Rustad, the Conservative Party leader in British Columbia. And then they'll wonder why they keep sinking in the polls. And then they'll just attack the conservatives harder for disinformation and conspiracy theories and climate change denial, missing the point that most people care about affordability issues right now in BC because of how unaffordable things are.
Hmm. And that's one of the big issues too. Like I've said this before, and I stand by this: that if you gave me the media budget and complete and total comms control of the NDP, I could get them in second place in the polling easily. Like I can even come up with my ad campaigns and my strategy campaigns right now. I'm not going to say them because I don't want to help the NDP for free.
No,
But
if they were smart enough to take your advice, they would be listening to your podcast. But I don't think they are.
touche. But like I can think of what I would do right now, and every single thing I see the NDP actually do is not that. They don't even come close to the things that they need to do to gain ground. For example, Singh, as we mentioned earlier, spent the better part of the last year complaining about quote unquote price gouging in grocery stores. And it's like, what are you doing? First off, what he has no solutions for this actual problem other than a windfall tax, which would just make the problem worse. Because I'm not sure if Singh's aware of this, but legally speaking, corporations legally have to pass the tax on to the customer because they're legally not allowed to reduce the profit margins. They will get sued by their stockholders, and they'll lose if they reduce their profit margins for no reason. So, a windfall tax would just be immediately passed on to consumers by law. That's how corporations work in the West. So that's just obviously stupid. But even then, how does that work? How does a windfall tax stop Loblaws from having a 3% profit margin?
And I think I've said this before too, but like they're also winning no new people by this war they're having with Galen Weston and Loblaws. Every single person who believes that price gouging is occurring and the only solution is price controls and effectively trying to have the government take over the grocery industry are already voting NDP. And we have a great example of another thing like this that just happened today, where an NDP candidate, federal NDP candidate, running in one of the by elections, has literally the Palestinian flag on his literature. Who is that winning you that you did not already have if you're the NDP?
Hmm.
If anything, you should be actually, if you were smart as the NDP, you should actually be trying to win over disaffected Jewish voters in Montreal and Toronto that the Liberals have just given up, mostly to the Conservatives, because of how weak they are against the pro-Palestinian protesters in the streets who are just openly anti-Semitic. Like, if I know the NDP has always been even more to the left on the Israel and Palestine issue, but like if I could do anything, I would start talking about how the Liberals aren't calling out anti-Semitism enough. That would be all you'd have to do to get a lot of generally more left-leaning Jewish voters in Toronto who have been used to voting for the Liberals for a couple decades, because they're maybe uncomfortable with voting Conservative because it feels like such a betrayal of how they used to vote and who they used to support. If you just start calling out anti-Semitism a lot, as Jagmeet saying, "Oh, I've faced a lot of bigotry in Canada, and I'm here to protect the Jewish community," he would immediately probably gain a couple of points in Toronto.
And that's a good example of where a lot of this failing for the Liberals, the NDP, goes into. And the Green Party, too, to a lesser extent, but they're much more marginal these days, ever since they imploded in 2021. But if you guys recall my last video on this channel, I was talking about how like there's different coalitions in voters, and you expand your vote pool by winning different identifiable groups that vote similarly. And what you see the NDP and the Liberals do time and again right now is they just go to the same groups that they're currently winning and double down on them. For example, like the Liberals will be down in the polls, and their first instinct every single time is to go guns, abortion, climate change. Every time. NDP does this too. BC NDP is doing it too in BC.
Well, and even Jagmeet Singh actually the other day basically celebrated the fact that this is all he does, because he posted a poll result showing that, do you know that the NDP is currently winning women under the age of 35? Yeah. Okay, well, what other good stat do you have? And that's all the NDP plays to, is women under the age of 35 on the issue of abortion, on social issues that younger people are into because they can live frivolously at this time of their lives, and other sort of just like, compassion type issues that tend to do really well with college age, university age women. Like, that's a travesty that you're even celebrating that this is your one big group. That is a very, and I'm not saying it's like women in general, obviously, but very young female voters tend to be very hyper niche voters.
They also tend to
just as young men are actually niche voters too, that the PPC celebrates, that it can win like 10% of men between the ages of like 18 and 24. It's like, okay, but they also don't vote, and those are voters who are very subject to changing in terms of their priorities in life.
And the other thing too with, for example, the NDP's celebrating the under 35 women vote, is the under 35 women vote among most demographics is one of the fastest to change. And when I say that, I mean when women, well, in general terms, as people get older, life events happen that make them more conservative. But the default disposition of a young woman versus a disposition of a woman who has a house, a job, kids, is very different. Men don't go through as drastic of a change as women do when they become mothers. It's a much bigger change. And becoming a father is a big change. And that means a lot of time, like, the under 35 women might be very left-wing, but then you look at 50-year-old women, and they're much more centrist. They might even be right-wing, depending on where you're looking at. And that happens every time. That's not a fluke of one generation. That's normal. So just celebrating that you're winning this one very niche, very flaky group of voters who everyone knows life is going to change their worldview, it's defeatist.
Now, I'm going to try and compete with you and try and say the most sexist thing on this podcast. No, I'm just kidding. Neither of us are. But I was just going to say that in a certain sense, and this is why men are more conservative when they're younger, is I think that the social environment, or the social pressures when you're younger as a woman is to, like, to use Zoomer terms, you're a compassion and empathy maxer when you're a woman, because that's very much like a lot of youth culture for women is very much like empathy and compassion type pursuits and interests, whereas men are like, even when you're younger, you're supposed to like really value responsibility and proving that you're independent and mature and whatnot, which actually tends to make you early on start caring more about like tax issues and personal responsibility and independence earlier. even though you could say that on an actual life, in terms of how they live, usually younger women tend to be far more responsible than younger men. But in terms of like what you're supposed to value, younger men tend to actually vote more like older voters than young women do.
That is a great way to phrase that. Okay, I just bringing up an Angus Reid poll here. Just
Yeah, hopefully it doesn't sound too abstract to the audience, but I mean, you if you meet a lot of younger women, one, they tend to be in more empathy based like areas of study in university, a lot more sociology, a lot more psychology, a lot more anthropology, arts in general. I'm saying this as somebody with an arts degree, whereas men are going to be more in like trades, engineering, medicine, although even the types of medicine men and women go into disproportionately are different. Men tend to become doctors more, and women tend to be nurses. Nursing tends to actually be the more empathetic line of work, whereas being a doctor is I'm getting in there to replace the knee and I'm getting out and leaving the room and letting nurses comfort you in terms of getting you back to your room and making sure that you're doing all right.
Yeah, so just to show what I meant with this poll, because I should have brought this up earlier. So, like, we look here, this Angus Reid poll says 44% of under 35 women are voting NDP, 31% are voting Conservative. Then by the time you get to 55 plus women, it's 38 to 17. That's not a generational fluke. Like, boomers are more left wing than millennials are, objectively, over the course of history. Like, picture every left wing social policy win. The boomers were the young people who voted for it.
Even conservative boomers, they still tend to talk about Social Security as like a really big issue. And often a lot of conservative boomers, it's like how efficiently is the government managing Social Security.
Yeah.
Whereas like millennial men and women will be more, who are voting conservative, care more about like being left alone to, operate in the free market themselves, less government intervention, all this type of stuff. Where again, it's like, yeah, with older people, they more so take for granted that Social Security is just, and everyone cares about it, kind of an issue.
And you also do see the same kind of trend here, but this young sample for middle-aged sample for men is probably an outlier. This is the most aggressive one I've seen for 35 to 54 men in Canada. It's probably a bit of an outlier, but the point still stands here. Like, this is the same kind of deal you see. Like, as you get older, you get slightly more conservative because life events make people more conservative. Not age. Age is nothing. Life events do. Having kids, getting a job, having a house, that kind of stuff, right? And this, just to circle back here, is where I see a lot of the problems in Canada when you're talking about left-wing parties, is they don't know what to do. As I said earlier, the Liberals, their first instinct is to talk about abortion, guns, climate change. And you know what factions that the Liberals already win? They win people who are really pro-choice already. They win people who are really anti-gun already. They win people, for the most part, who are really concerned with climate. And the people who they don't win, really concerned with climate, the NDP or the Greens win. The people the Conservatives winning aren't those demographics. They don't care about abortion. They don't care about banning guns. They are less concerned about the climate. So jumping on those three issues is just reinforcing voters that the Liberals or the NDP or the Greens or whatever already win.
And as we've said in the past too, those are luxury issues in the sense that they are issues you can care about as a luxury. When you're doing well or you don't have a lot of responsibilities, you can care more about those type of social issues. And so that's actually why, honestly, I bump into at the doors a lot more older people who will mention climate than I will bump into middle-aged voters. In terms of 60-plus voters are more likely to care about the climate than voters who are 45. Because someone who's 45 is less likely to actually own their home. They're still paying their mortgage down. Whereas somebody who's 60 years old, they own their house, especially in British Columbia. You own a house that's like $1.5 million worth. You can sell it and go somewhere else whenever you want. And so you have more disposable time to worry about an abstract issue like the climate because you don't actually even work a job anymore.
Another thing worth mentioning too on this one And this is old news, right? Like, you think they should have looked into this more, but no. Apparently, the left-wing parties of Canada haven't thought about this. But you look at this and you're like, oh, why are 18 to 34 men plurality voting Conservative? That's crazy. This demographic historically has never done this. And you can some high-level things and talk about the things you hear. But what it really boils down to, right? And you see this if you're a young guy and you know other young guys. It really, the number one thing is houses, right? The amount of young guys I know who are left wing, who have a left wing temperament, who are considering or going to vote for someone like Poilievre because with a normal income, they're not poor, they have a normal middle class income, that they have no hope of buying a house. They have no hope of buying a house if they married someone who had the exact same job as them. A normal middle class job. And you're telling people who have two normal middle class jobs, a couple, that is, that there's nowhere in the entire province you can buy a house. Well, nowhere you can commute to work and buy a house. Well, you lose them. They're not coming to you.
But also, I think another thing to look into here is, again, comparing that male number to the female number for the same age bracket. And I think a big issue, because there is, and it is true that there is a big gender separation that's happening in politics in North America in general, where a lot more men vote for conservative things and women vote for more left-wing things. But it's a fairly dramatic difference between men 18 to 34 and women 18 to 34. And part of the issue is that because people like Jagmeet Singh of the NDP have doubled down so much on that under 35 female vote, they've made left-wing parties feel very unmasculine. So you get a lot more younger guys who vote conservative because, I'm not an LGBTQ activist. I'm not like somebody who goes around with like feminist as heck on a t-shirt. And so I'm going to vote conservative because it feels like the normal, responsible guy thing to do. And again, that's very much, I think, a cultural reason why a lot of men will then, or a lot of younger guys will then vote conservative, is it feels like the responsible, I'm trying to act like a mature person at the age of 20 thing to do.
Yeah, and you combine that too with that mentality, and you look at guys who have actual real life problems that they can't buy a house, for example. And then you have one party who only talks about like luxury niche problems for young women, and no problems that young men have. And then it's like, well, why are they going to vote for them? Why would you vote with people who never talk about the problems you're having in life?
And on the issue with housing too, I think where men and women separate a bit is as a man, I think it's very much in your head that one day I'm going to have to pay for a house. Whereas if you're a woman, because the expectation is you're going to get married, you're thinking, me and my husband are going to have to pay for a house. There's almost immediately the expectation that we're going to kind of burden it together, where if you're a man, you're like thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to buy a house. And so that becomes an even bigger issue in your mind than it would be for a woman.
Yeah.
To again, not sound too sexist here, but that's just how things generally work.
Well, in my experience with talking to young men and women, the men are much more concerned about housing, full stop, than women are. I mean, like, my wife she doesn't even think about it. Well, we have a house now, but like, not even on her radar. She has other things she's worried about, and that's fine. I don't think everyone in a couple has to be worried about every single issue simultaneously. That'd be ridiculous. That's why you have two people. Separation of, like, specialization and all that stuff, right? But that's how.
Well, and then women are going to usually care more about education-based issues because you're thinking, where are my kids going to go to school?
Yeah.
And that just tends to be disproportionately something that women are going to be like really, really concerned about because they tend to be most sensitive to issues around kids.
And again, anecdotally, I can tell you, I don't have kids yet, but my wife is absolutely, that's like her number one priority. It's like, where are our kids going to go to school? How are we going to educate them? How are we going to get them all this stuff that's going to make them successful in life? It's already a priority. We don't even have kids yet. And a lot of people are like that. That's normal. And there's nothing wrong with that. Turns out men and women are not the same people. We're different. But that's not bad. But let us take a slight pivot here, because we're talking about all sorts of stuff here about Canada and the failures of the NDP, the Liberals. And there's an interesting cross comparison we can make here, because there's an election going on right now in the US. And the cross comparison I want to make here, and I'm sure Wyatt has his own he wants to bring up, is regarding to Kamala Harris's campaign versus Trump's campaign. And we see Kamala Harris is making literally the same mistakes to the T that Trudeau and Singh are doing. The only caveat is, for the large part, the GOP's not very good at elections, so it's more forgiving for the Democrats. But Harris does make the same mistakes. Her campaign, her party, reflexively talk about abortion, gun bans, climate. Whenever something happens, they talk about those things.
And I'll also here's another thing to add in. This isn't just mistakes that the Liberals and the NDP in Canada keep making. These are mistakes that Kamala Harris made back in 2019 when she was trying to run in the 2020 Democratic primary. And that's where I've not understood why there was so much optimism when she became the Democratic Party's nominee for president, that she was going to do wildly better than she performed in the Democratic primaries. Obviously, it's a very different type of race, but the fact that you couldn't win the tryouts for the presidency in 2020 is very telling of your political instincts. And in certain ways, she's obviously a much better candidate, but there's already a lot of flaws with the way she's been doing things that demonstrate why people like Nate Silver, even though technically the polling shows her having the edge, Nate Silver keeps downgrading her chances of winning every single day, where now she's only at like 38% chance of winning. And it's because of a lot of bad moves she's made on policies that alienate people in the middle and double down on voters that she probably already has.
A good example of one of these policies is she came out relatively recently with this 25% tax on unrealized gains over $100 million. And the argument from her and Democrat surrogates is that almost no one's going to pay this tax. It's a very small percentage of the population who's going to pay this tax. And the idea is the same idea that the Liberals did when they in Canada, when they changed the capital gains tax inclusion rate for incomes for capital gains over $250,000. And it's the same idea. It's like, oh, this is only affecting a really tiny percentage of people. And it's like, true. But that doesn't matter, because turns out people are capable of abstract thinking, and they can see that if you do something that dramatically hurts a very small percentage of the population, that could have cascading effects that hurt everybody. Most policies do not just have a first order effect, they have second, third, fourth, fifth order effects.
And by the way, this is all taxes. There's no such thing as a tax that everyone doesn't pay. It just depends on how big it is and just how big that knock-on effect is going to be. If you had a 100% tax on POGs, even in the year 2024, everyone would pay that tax. It's a silly tax, but there is no such thing as a tax that doesn't get passed on to other people, because if one person's costs go up, they are going to raise the cost of their services or products for other people, even if it seems so fringe.
Mm-hmm. And this kind of the goal of this policy too, and the same thing when the Liberals did the same thing in the spring here, is it's doubling down on a demographic they're already winning. They're doubling down on the kind of economic left people who don't like rich people, and they want to tax them away. That's the demographic they're going for. And that demographic already votes for the Democrats.
And by the way, she also has that other policy, again, exactly like Jagmeet Singh. This is also where I always find it obnoxious whenever people who are conservatives in Canada then be like, oh, but I hate Trump and the Republicans. I'm like, guys, the conservatives in Canada are not that different from the Republicans in the U.S. They're just generic, smaller government conservative policies for the most part. Yes, the conservatives in Canada are probably significantly more, when I say to the left, not that they're going into the actual left side of the spectrum, but there may be more to the left than like Wyoming conservatives, but that's a very different type of conservative because it's a very different type of state compared to all of Canada. But and then they'll like then like you'll have conservatives in Canada saying, oh yeah, no, Harris, I'd vote for Harris. Like she's more like Jagmeet Singh than she's even like Justin Trudeau. Her policy on like price gouging and price fixing is something that even in a certain sense the NDP is not even proposing. And that policy too, what's so foolish about pushing it in this presidential election is that's a policy that, or that's kind of an issue that Joe Biden's been pushing for like 2 years, trying to claw back popularity, and it hasn't been working. Remember when he did that very strange pre-taped video during the Super Bowl talking about how like there's like shrinkflation with potato chips?
Mm-hmm.
Like nobody actually cared what he was talking about because everyone understands that inflation is a government issue. It's not a grocery store issue.
So what we end up seeing across in the U.S. here is, like, for example, let's go here. So as we just explain it, so Biden withdraws at this point, and there's a big bump all the way up until like mid-August for Harris, because it turns out
when was the DNC? Sorry, when was the DNC? When did the DNC happen again? The convention.
I think it was the week of the 19th of August, I think. It was that week, I think.
Wow, because I'm looking at that thing, and that you can't even tell when the convention happened. Barely.
Like, there's a little bit of a blip, but not much. But we see this big bump, and definitely there was going to be. It makes sense that there's a bump because Biden posts this debate, which happens like around here or something like that. I don't recall the exact day that debate was. Oh, probably like here when the polling widens. Anyways, that debate really showed the U.S. that he wasn't fit for president. Like, he could barely talk, and that's a problem. So Harris jumping in, it makes sense. She made a big bump because she can actually communicate. She's like not on the verge of death, which is tragic.
Also, it had nothing to do. Yeah, it's that she wasn't on the verge of death, and it's not because, well, she's also a pretty good candidate. You could have just said anybody. Anybody's now the candidate, and that's really what she's polling like. She's more so polling like generic Democrat because not enough people knew who she was.
And I would say that from like this point up until recently, let's say all of August, I think she was just polling as generic Democrat because she hadn't really had a chance to really put any policies out. She had no time. It's only been a month since she was in charge. And she's not the president, so she can't really do anything in and of herself. So it took a little time, but as we're starting to see now, it's filtering through. And like, we're seeing things like the New York Times, Siena have Trump up a point. And then you actually look into this cross table. You look at this regionality. Trump's 11 points up in the Midwest. That's game, set, match. That's the election. That would sweep Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. It might even make Illinois.
Minnesota would be tight, but hilariously, that's actually the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats' state where he's governor, Tim Walz.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he didn't give her a Midwestern bump's pretty pathetic. You could say maybe it's just because Trump's winning Tennessee and Ohio so hard that's why the Midwestern number looks like this. But those aren't usually like hyper red states like the way that West Virginia or Wyoming
and it's worth noting,
they're like +8, +10 states.
And it's worth noting too that in 2016, Trump won the Midwest by only 5 points. This is a 6-point stronger win than 2016 for Trump, and he was pretty close to Minnesota in 2016. He was only 3 points behind.
Yeah, and you always have to factor in that a lot of polls, and this isn't sometimes in the U.S. There's actually a lot more shenanigans with polls than there are in Canada because it's a big industry in the U.S. So campaigns will pay for better looking polls just because it helps their candidates' momentum, and news publications who have a certain narrative like a poll that backs them up. But typically the polls, regardless if they're shenanigans or not, tend to underpoll the Republicans because Republicans have have demographics that like them who are harder to poll. And Trump also tends to bring out a lot of lower propensity voters who don't vote in midterms. They may be voted in 50% of presidential elections before 2016, but they will show up for Donald Trump. A lot of people who work in trades, farmers, people who it's difficult to poll. And so somewhere like Wisconsin, right before the 2020 presidential election, there were multiple polls from different pollsters that showed Biden up 10. One of them showed Biden up 14 points. That state was within 0.2 on election night.
And we can actually see a good example of this here. September 8th, 2020, Biden has a 7.1 lead. He only wins by 4.5. Clinton's up 2.8, September 8th, 2016. She only wins by 2.1. Like, this is a pretty consistent thing versus specifically Trump. And it is worth noting that it's specifically Trump, and it's not just because it's necessarily Trumpism or MAGA or whatever you want to call it. It's that Trump ushered in a coalition change in the U.S. While in the Bush-Obama era, rural areas in the Midwest, for example, were competitive. The Democrats were close to 50% of the vote in rural areas across the country in the U.S., but the Republicans dominated the suburbs. Now the suburbs are close to 50-50, but the rural areas are like 70% Republican. And that changes a lot of things. And rural areas are harder to pull for various reasons. Farmers are hard to reach. Just honestly, they're hard to reach. But also, especially in places like Pennsylvania or other areas, you have a lot of rural population that are like groups like Mennonites or the Amish who literally don't answer polls. But they will vote sometimes.
And another problem that you end up having for the Democrats is, although you could say it's a bigger coup to be able to tighten up the suburbs than it is to win the rural areas, because of course a lot of rural districts in many of these states, super low populations. So I'd rather do better in the suburbs around Atlanta than have more of a rural vote. But the problem is, actually the urban vote also has trended more Republican in many states. I think the most fascinating one is New York, where Republicans can actually, in very dark red numbers, win boroughs of New York City now, which has significantly tightened up a lot of these. Not tightened up, that makes it sound like there's even a chance that they would be able to win the overall district. They can't. But it really hurts the Democrats when they're not winning something like the Bronx with 92% of the vote. If they're only winning the Bronx with 85, that's horrifying. And when you add in candidates, and I don't think Trump's going to win New York in this presidential election. If Biden was still on the ballot, maybe. But in 4 to 8 years, I could easily see a Republican winning New York State by running up the numbers in upstate New York, Staten Island, Long Island, and then just kind of holding the Democrats down a little bit in New York City.
And one thing that helps that too, I touched on this in my first U.S. video, but there is a trend in the U.S. that the states that are losing population trend to the right, and states that gain population trend to the left. And part of this, and this isn't just internal or international immigrants coming in, it's internal too. And it's not always every group. Like, for example, Texas is probably trending right because of internal immigration, but we're talking broad strokes here. There's outliers, obviously. But you look at places like New York. Who's leaving New York City? Because New York City is the part of New York State that's losing people. Who's leaving New York City? People who are leaving New York City are people who are the easiest to move, that have the fewest roots, the least local community. And those people tend to be more liberal because the people who are more willing to just move to another city tend to be more cosmopolitan, and cosmopolitanism is positively correlated with liberalism. So you see who's leaving New York City to go to Connecticut? Liberals. Who's leaving New York City to go to Boston? Liberals. Who's leaving New York City to go to Arizona? Liberals. So that leaves the population behind who are more broadly conservative. They don't move as much. And then you have other considerations too, where you start seeing Republicans start seeing this, and then they'll start pivoting their message and trying to win these voters, like you saw Lee Zeldin do in 2022. He ultimately lost, but getting Kathy Hochul to only like a 6-point win in New York State, it's very close.
Previous wins by Democrats were like plus 15, especially with Andrew Cuomo around. And yeah, like and it wasn't just because Lee Zeldin had a stronger appeal with Jewish voters, which you would assume he's a Jewish candidate. There's like rampant anti-Semitism in New York City that the Democrats won't deal with. Asian voters were actually going really hard for the Republicans in that was it like that 22 midterm election.
Yeah.
I was wondering if it was like the off years because I knew New Jersey was the off year. Who again, Jack Ciattarelli almost became the governor of New Jersey with basically $5 and a ham sandwich. There was literally a guy who unseated the House Democratic speaker in New Jersey who spent $100. If people get sick of the people currently in office, you do not have to work that hard to get rid of them, and that's effectively what's happening, in my opinion, at least, or my perspective, in British Columbia. The Conservatives are at massive disadvantages for fundraising, but it doesn't matter how much money you have or don't have. If people hate the current government, they're going to vote for the alternative. But Asian voters went for Lee Zeldin in many of these boroughs, and that's why some of the boroughs went Republican. And a borough is obviously a much smaller district. It's more like a polling station almost, not the entire district overall. But because Asian voters basically got ignored because Kathy Hochul and the Democrats had doubled down on the black vote in New York City. And so a lot of Asian voters got really ticked off because they were like, their communities were getting like hit by criminals and the police weren't doing anything about it. Well, the police would like to, but it's just local prosecutors didn't want to do anything about it, or DAs. And so those people who, even though Asian voters actually tend to be pretty reliable, more center-left voters, not left voters, but center-left voters, because generally the attitude of a lot of Asian voters is, I don't want to rock the boat. And center-left tends to be a very socially acceptable thing to vote. You don't have to defend voting more moderate Democrat or more moderate liberal. But when things get bad enough, they will swing hard conservative or Republican if the issues are not being addressed.
Well, we end up seeing... Oh, sorry, you go.
But I was just going to queue up another little topic here, kind of in the general vicinity of New York State. But that poll that you were just looking at actually gives Trump pretty good numbers in the Northeast too, where I could see Trump being able to win both of the up for grabs districts in Maine, or even New Hampshire itself, or New Hampshire right next door. Not right next door. What am I saying? I'm pretty sure it's Vermont that's next door to Maine. I'm not an American citizen. I'm sorry.
My geography, stronger. It's New Hampshire beside it. But yeah, it's certainly possible. That's why actually one of the interesting things about this elections going on in the U.S. is, and I've touched on this in my videos on it, but it's one of those things where we're kind of in a possible coalition shake-up election. I think all the Trump era has been coalition shaking up. And as I've touched on before, my theory actually predicts this, and one day I'll make a video about theory, but anyways. But we are seeing a coalition shakeup, and it could very well be the case that Trump does do well and wins New Hampshire, maybe wins Maine at large. It could also be the case that this 2%, because in 2016, full disclaimer, this is a 13-point lead here. It was 15-point lead in 2016 for the Democrats in the Northeast. It could very well be the case, though, that this 15-point lead, this narrowing the lead by 2 points, is because states like New York or New Jersey became dramatically closer. And at first, that might seem kind of useless, but if you're in a situation where, let's say hypothetically in 10 years, Texas becomes a purple state, but then New York becomes a purple state, it's a wash. Nothing really changed on the electoral map, that is. And I think we are seeing that because you look at the leadership of the Trump campaign. Now, this is not certain to be staying true because it could be changed when the next Republican presidential nominee comes in. But the leadership of the Republican Party is trending towards a more... What's the word for it? It's there's not really a good label for this. I guess you could call it America First, but that's not really an ideology.
Or blue collar.
They're like leaning into things like protectionism. They're leaning into reindustrialization and all that kind of stuff, which plays really well in a lot of these states that used to be industrial powerhouses. There's a reason why the Rust Belt is competitive for Trump, and it hasn't been competitive broadly for 30 years, other than for Trump. It's not even competitive for for the Republicans in midterms. They lost Pennsylvania, and they barely won Wisconsin in 2022, the Senate seat.
Oh yeah, like a more realistic state for a candidate for like Mitt Romney or John McCain to win would have been like Colorado.
And that's an interesting thing where you can kind of get with voter coalitions. There is trade-offs. Mitt Romney's and the John McCain's of the world could win New Hampshire pretty reliably. They could win places like Colorado. Trump can't win those states. Or at least, he can't win Colorado. New Hampshire, maybe. But he can't win Colorado. It's not really a possibility. And it's just, you have, in politics, you can't win everybody. It's not possible. You are picking someone, you're picking a group that you're going to get them to vote for you, and that necessarily means you're going to lose a different group. That's how it has to be. You can't win everyone.
And the interesting thing with Trump is that, in a certain sense, because he does have that celebrity aura to him, even still, even though he's very much, he's not really a celebrity at the same, because he's Trump, and that's really the only category you can put him in. He's Trump. He's not really in anything, but because he's just kind of, in a lot of people's minds, a figure of fun, he can actually, in certain cases, actually pick up new voters without having to sacrifice other ones. And that's why his margins have improved a lot with Black Americans. When it was considered good if you could get like 9% of the Black vote, if you're Mitt Romney, Trump can get like 16% potentially. It doesn't sound like a lot, but considering that in so many states, the Democrats need to basically at 95% of the Black vote to win, like in Georgia, that's devastating. If DeKalb County in Atlanta tightens up, like that's the entire election right there, because Trump's obviously going to run up the score hard in the rural areas of Georgia. If DeKalb County does not come in even bluer than it was probably in 2020, like the Democrats are dead in that state. And there really isn't the kind of mail-in ballot politics that there was back in 2020 for this election, where the 2020 election, in a certain sense, was not stolen, but it became who has a better political operation to go around picking up mail-in ballots. And Democrats tend to be far better community organizers than Republicans.
That's one of the reasons I've said before. I'm not sure if I've said it on YouTube, but I've definitely said it on Twitter, that I don't like mail-in voting, and I don't like early voting either, like even in precinct voting. And it has nothing to do with fraud. It has nothing to do with election integrity. It's just those two things, in precinct early voting and mail-in voting, mean that people like me, data dude who crunches numbers on which voters and which demographics you can win, turns an election into spreadsheet math. Who has the best spreadsheets and who has the most volunteers, instead of being about trying to find issues that resonate with voters and getting them to vote for you. It really gamifies everything, and I don't think elections should be gamified.
Yeah, and if it's only voting on election day, you can keep swinging by someone's house, but you can only convince them to show up on election day. Sorry, but as much as people want to think, oh, it's more democratic if you can vote for an entire month, like in some of these states, it's not really, because if you weren't willing to show up on election day, or let's say if you had election day take 3 days, that's a very different type of a voter than somebody who is committed to showing up on election day. And if it's only election day, you can swing by that person's house as many times as you like, but you can only convince them to show up on that day. And if the person wasn't going to show up unless they had all of these easy ways of voting, then I would say that you could legitimately say that their vote in a certain sense matters less than the person who is very decided on showing up on election day, because that's someone who knows what they want, rather than probably somebody who the campaign keeps harassing them, keeps telling them where the voting station is, and they picked up groceries, and I guess it's right there, I'm going to go vote. That's not the same quality of voting.
Yeah, and a big issue too is if you change it so it's easy for everyone to vote, in a sense. Like, you can vote whenever you want for a month. then the election seems unfair to the people who are really passionate and really dedicated and they really want change, because what you're essentially doing is you're letting campaigns go out and find a very low marginal propensity voter, someone who will not vote unless you walk up to their house, knock on their door, show them the mail-in ballot form, say, "Hey, can you check a few boxes and sign your name on this so I can put it in the mailbox for you." There's nothing illegal about that. There's no fraudulent thing about that. That's perfectly legitimate. But that means that feels wrong to people who are going out and voting in the precinct, that are going out and doing the normal thing. And that's how you get all this conspiracy theories about the integrity of elections, because people are
Well,
like,
that's where
what?
and that's where I say, like, the election was not stolen, but it wasn't really that much of an election when in a lot of states the margin was easily made up by what activists could go out and bring in by telling somebody just mark Biden on the ballot and then we'll send it in. Because there was in a lot of those states, they said a disproportionately high amount of people who only marked the presidential side and didn't mark any other, local representative, senator, like judge candidates or anything like that. There's not that many people who show up to an actual in-person voting station and just only mark one option. Usually you tend to mark the rest of it, even if you don't know the candidates. You're like, well, that person's a Republican, I'm going to go down ballot Republican, I'm going to go down ballot Democrat, because most people vote down ballot just straight ticket one party. The amount of people who do split ticketing is pretty minor in any general election. But yeah, like if people are only marking one candidate and they're disproportionately the mail-in voters, I guarantee it's just because they didn't want to be harassed to fill out the rest of it, and you could only get the person to fill out the top line, which it really puts into question whether or not that person even wanted to vote for the presidency, or it's just that they've had somebody come to their house and harass them 6 times, and this is the only way they can get them to go away.
And I also see kind of people argue for this, and then it's like, as you briefly touched on, it's like it's more democratic, it's more fair, or something like that. But it really does. There's an interesting philosophical question to be had. What are we doing in an election? Is an election just, hey, we get everyone's opinion on who should be in government, or should there be a factor of motivation? If you want to make it really easy for people to vote, quote unquote, so everyone votes, you really should go to something more like a mandatory voting regime, so where everyone legally has to vote every single time.
Yeah, but even that has its own problems, like in Brazil, where there's just flat out videos of people being given goodies if they go and vote for Lula da Silva.
Sure, there's all sorts of problems that you get.
Where now everyone can be bought for their vote because they have to vote anyway, so why not at least exploit the fact that you can say, well, I have to vote and I might vote against the guy you don't like unless I get $100.
Yeah, that's a big issue that you have to try to resolve, and that's not a trivial thing to resolve. I'm not even really sure. Like, yeah, you can say, oh, well, it should be illegal to do that. Okay, but that means you have to enforce that. The first, number one thing you have to know about law is it doesn't matter what your law says if you can't enforce it. What makes law exist is enforcement. If you do not enforce it, the law does not exist. So it doesn't matter if you say, oh, it's illegal to bribe people. Okay, you get to figure out how to enforce that now.
Yeah, just look at shoplifting, frankly, anywhere in North America right now. If you're not going to enforce the law, it doesn't matter.
And then you see some of this pop up. There's a couple of Republican states after 2020 who passed laws specifically to try to make it easier to crack down on potential vote bribing. And then people got really upset about it because it was things like you can't pass out water bottles to people at precincts anymore. That was one of the results of those laws being passed. And people were like, oh, that's so ridiculous. It's so unfair. And it's like...
People intentionally misread the bill. The whole point is that you can't be wearing like a vote for my candidate t-shirt as you're going around handing out bottles of water.
Sure. But I guess the point I'm trying to make with that is to do that, you have to start banning a whole bunch of things that actually provide tickets and fines and things that, like, do you really want to do that? Is that really resources you want to spend? Because you have to do that if you're doing mandatory voting. Whereas if you only let people... if you don't have mandatory voting, and it's only voluntary, and the only people who end up voting are people who are motivated, that's not really a concern. Like, you're not going to bribe someone who's going to vote for, say, Pierre Poilievre to vote for Trudeau by giving him a water bottle. You might be able to bribe the guy who's only going to vote because he's legally required to, or else he's going to get a fine. That's not a very hard bribe. It might not even be an intentional bribe, but unintentional bribes are a thing. Believe me, I had work training about that. They're very concerned about us accidentally bribing people, which is really funny, because I'm not customer facing, but you know.
But maybe let's get back to just because I was sort of thinking about stuff related to just the marketing of both candidates, and maybe we could even talk about the debate happening on Tuesday for the presidential election. Right now, I would say that, and a lot of people are very. I'm trying to speak from a purely neutral perspective, but a lot of people from the Republican side can get very doomerish, like, oh, look, the Democrats are still ahead. Oh goodness, how could people be voting for Harris? This is useless. Like, guys, the problem for Democrats is that you, at least in the last few election cycles, you got to win the national popular vote by like 4 points to actually win, because you can really run up the score in states like Oregon, Washington, like California, New York, Vermont, but not actually have the votes allocated in the areas you need. So in a lot of these states that Harris is like neck and neck with Trump with, for her entire platform is actually basically shooting her in the foot, in the sense that a lot of the people who need to be won over are like moderate suburban voters who in theory should be turned off by Trump's personality, but as soon as you start talking about price controls, you're in danger. And then with the debate coming up, and if you saw that CNN interview with Dana Bash, with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, that did not help people vote Democrat, to put it lightly, in the sense that a lot of her thing is that she's the moderate, normal candidate against the crazy man Trump, but the more she actually is seen, the more it's hurting her, because she's no longer being ballparked like generic Democrat, because generic Democrat and generic Republican pretty much 80% of the time perform better than a Republican or Democratic candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I can ask a question to you, what do you think each candidate needs to do if they want to win the presidential election?
So I'll start with Harris, because my opinion for Trump is actually kind of possibly controversial, but I think it's a brilliant strategy. But we'll start with Harris.
I'm waiting for it.
So Harris, to win, my 2 cents is she needs to stop doubling down on voters she already has. So stop with this talk about price controls. Stop with talking about taxing unrealized capital gains. Stop talking about abortion. Full stop. Don't even mention it. Stop. Don't talk about gun bans. Stop talking about climate change. What she should do, and this is a big one, and this would be really helpful, she needs to take the Inflation Reduction Act that Biden passed and stump hard on that and say, this is what we're going to do. Because, for those of you not aware, the Inflation Reduction Act, contrary to its name, does nothing about inflation. It's an entirely massive protectionist subsidy bill. In theory, the goal is to rebuild American high-tech industry, like silicon wafers, stuff like that. Like, we're not talking like soda cans. We're talking like we're gonna take TSMC and make it American, like that kind of stuff, right? Stump hard on that. Stump hard on targeted things for unions or other things that will help shore up Rust Belt areas. Because you're probably going to the Democrats are probably going to gain ground in places like Arizona and Nevada as long as they're normal. Georgia too. But they have to make sure that they don't lose the blue-collar manufacturing Rust Belt areas to Trump by getting undercut, by getting distracted and off target, and talking about things that they don't give a shit about. Meanwhile, for Trump, Trump has a very different thing he has to do. So Trump has good instincts for the most part, but he has a problem in that he puts his foot in his mouth. And a good classic...
What? No. I even like Trump, but yeah, that is kind of his problem.
So a recent example of this, of putting his foot in his mouth, is he made comments vis-a-vis IVF and Floridian abortion referendum that really pissed off a lot of pro-lifers. And that's a problem, because he doesn't need to practically win pro-lifers, because they should vote for him anyways. But you don't antagonize them. Because if you antagonize them, they might just be like, well, there's no point, and they won't vote. You have to just tacitly accept them. And this is where Poilievre actually does this strategy really well, is Trump actually does want Harris talking about abortion. The Democrats' best thing they can do for Trump is to talk about abortion. Every moment they talk about abortion, that does nothing for them, and it helps Trump. Because Trump's biggest issue in the last, for his own existing coalition, is he keeps eating his foot on pro-life issues. And it's causing a lot of pro-lifers to be like, well, I don't want to vote for him anymore. They probably still will, but this will help shore up his own base, and he doesn't say anything. Trump should just not talk about it. Bait Harris into attacking him over it, and just say nothing. Do nothing. And then when he needs...
I'd say the only thing he probably should speak out on in terms of the pro-life issue is every time she talks about the need for, like, you know, full freedom, he's like 9th month abortions, that's pretty crazy, and then that's all he has to say.
Yeah, you could do something very simple like that, like very tame, very broad appeal, but otherwise don't really mention it, don't really talk about it. Something that Poilievre does in Canada works very well. And instead, he should spend his time talking about the economy, immigration. That's the really big one. And, like, this is a bit controversial, but his slogan, mass deportations, is a good one. Because it gets the exact voters he needs, and the voters who don't like that will never vote for him. End of story, regardless of whether that slogan existed or not. And he needs to keep doubling down on things like that. And if he does that, and he keeps the Democrats by baiting them with, like, trivial bait on attacking about guns or talking about abortion, and it's going to be an easy win for him. As contrary to a lot of people's opinions, and I'm really discordant on this one, I think abortion is a losing issue for the Democrats. I think it's a losing issue for the Liberals. I think it's a losing issue for the NDP.
It was actually, I would consider a completely false narrative that Lindsey Graham had hurt the Republicans in the 22 midterm election by coming out during that cycle and basically proposing a federal abortion policy in the Senate. That didn't hurt them at all. What hurt them was the Republicans just ran bad campaigns, but everyone likes to pick out the one moment where a lot of, like, people gasped at something. He proposed, like, basically a European standard that wouldn't have offended anybody, but everyone wanted to explain why the Republicans did bad in the 22 cycle, and a little bit of it was bad candidate quality, and number two was actually something that was exacerbated by bad candidate quality, where I actually tend to like Mitch McConnell, but there was a lot of shenanigans with people that Trump was picking, because there was probably some people in the Republican Party who were trying to slant the primaries towards DeSantis, which you just really can't do that. Either he's good enough to beat Trump or he's not. But they weren't funding Trump candidates like Blake Masters. So he ran against Mark Kelly in Arizona with literally only $3 million, where Mark Kelly had like $23 million.
Mm-hmm.
But it had nothing to do with Lindsey Graham. If anything, Lindsey Graham is actually a very moderate voice, despite the fact he's actually one of the more conservative senators.
I will say, too, I actually think Lindsey Graham helped the Republican Party by saying that. Because
I thought at the end of the day, he proposed a very rational policy. So while people are saying they're going to do a full ban, he comes out with a European standard, which Republican commentators are like, oh my goodness, why is he saying that? They're going to think we're radical. No. He actually silenced the issue by saying, we just want, 15 weeks, which 80% of people think is a very reasonable limit.
And that's, if the Republicans have to talk about abortion, like for some reason they're trapped into it in a debate, for example, right? Trump's in a debate, he's trapped, he has to say something. The solution, because abortion is not a winning issue for the Democrats. It's a issue that the Republicans sometimes hang themselves on because they don't know what they want to do with it. But the easy response to this is either something like Lindsey Graham did, pick a moderate window that you can point to, say, like, Germany does this, France does this, Italy does this, like, all of Europe is like this. What's wrong? I thought you liked Europe. Something like that. Or you have to go triple down on something like J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance's position is, yeah, we're not going to have abortions, but we're going to have state-funded maternity wards. We're going to have change standards on maternity leave. We're going to do increase child tax credits, or maybe give direct cash funds like Canada does through the Canadian Child Benefit, etc., like that, to make being a parent easy, to remove a lot of costs for being a parent. And that also would work. Basically, what the Republicans need to do is they need to figure out what their policy is. And this is the big issue the Republican Party has, and why they utterly flop most of the time. And this isn't just under Trump. This has been, like, since Bush. Is the Republicans don't know what their message is. They don't know who they're talking to. They don't know who they're trying to appeal to. They don't know what they're trying to win. So you have some elements of the GOP who want to be the socially liberal business elites who really just want the economy to be real good. And you have people who don't give a flying brat about the economy and just want social wins. And there's no one big enough and strong enough to smack their heads together to make a coherent policy that unifies both groups. And that's really the biggest thing Canada has with the Conservatives in Canada have with Pierre Poilievre, is he was big enough to take those two groups, smack them upside the head, and be like, yo, we can do both of those things. We just can't do them to the degree that you want them.
And yeah, in the O'Toole approach, to use like the worst contrasting conservative to Poilievre, his thing was that social conservatives shut the heck up and get behind me on fiscal issues. It's like, that's not how you actually got those people to turn out. They went and voted PPC, but in fact mostly probably just stayed home. And then he completely floundered, because you can't just tell people that the mission's like, you know, the mission is more important than that singular issue, and hope that they're gonna, you have to be able to say not yet but someday, which is more of Poilievre's position on some of these issues.
And what Poilievre's issue in a lot of the position on a lot of these things, like let's pick MAID for example, is he's not saying we're going to ban MAID. What he's saying is we're going to claw back all the really dumb stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, you're going to get the people who are anti-MAID. The social conservatives who don't like MAID are going to vote for you for that. Because you're giving them something tangible. It's not everything they want, but it's a tangible policy victory. That's all they want.
And this is in a certain sense me playing into the left-wing media, but they don't watch this show, so it doesn't matter. In a certain sense, whenever they say, "Oh, eventually Poilievre's going to come after your, like, you know, rights as a woman to shoot a 9th-month baby in the head or whatever," like, in a certain sense, the MAID stuff actually does open that up later, because it gets people more used to it. The idea that, yeah, actually you can have social controls over, you know, people not ending their own lives or not ending a baby's life. So in a certain sense, the liberals are actually technically right that they are going to go after the quote unquote like reproductive rights, but it's because it's probably actually the vast majority of Canadians are kind of okay with it. They just think other people are not okay with it. So if we take the first step forward with getting rid of MAID for people with mental illness, you know, more people are saying, you know, that side of the aisle, in terms of not even aisle, but that side of the argument has a point that the way we were doing things before was a bit crazy. And so I could see in 10 years, you could absolutely probably restrict certain types of abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the left is right. It's just that they're wrong about this next election.
Well,
that Poilievre's not going to do anything this election, and he said, yes, me and my wife are pro-choice. Are they really? I know from people, from sources, that Poilievre's actually very personally pro-life.
And that's actually
for the purposes of this election, he's pro-choice. And so, yes, is the media fear-mongering is wrong in the sense that you shouldn't be scared of somebody who eventually one day might tell you not to kill a kid. But they're sort of right in the sense that that actually might eventually happen if we even make the most minor changes to policies on those specific social issues of MAID and abortion and other like issues around like the government funding contraceptives.
That's actually an interesting point, and it's a valid point. And what it boils down to, right, is you look at a lot of these social issues. Pick any social issue you want. Let's do something less controversial. We're gonna pick guns. The core position on guns isn't what regulations we need. It's should people be able to own guns, yes or no? If you say yes, you're going to want to have the laws in such a way that it's possible to own a gun. If you say no, you want to ban the guns. This is pretty straightforward. But once you have a position, so let's say right now in Canada, the default is yes, you should be able to own guns. We have a licensing system that's at request. They cannot deny you unless you fail to meet the qualifications for the license. One of the qualifications being criminal background check, but as long as you don't fail that, they cannot deny you a license. And if you have a license, they cannot deny you the sale of a gun that's legal to buy.
Well, and issues, and this is kind of my point, is that issues have momentum, and right now on a lot of these social issues, the liberals don't even have momentum on them because they're at their most far left position. That in Canada, despite what people will say, you can get abortions up to the point of birth, 100%. There's basically no laws. Yes, clinics will often not go past 24 weeks because even the people who run abortion clinics have some kind of conscience, but hospitals actually have to do them no matter what stage. It's just that they tend to tell you to go to a clinic, and then after 24 weeks, they have to accept you in hospital. They have statistics to prove that they 100% do them up to the 9th month. But as soon as we even do anything on the life issue that moves things into the more pro-life direction, it gives the issue momentum. So let's go back to guns. Because the liberals have ratcheted things so to the left, if the conservatives simply come in and scrap the gun ban, which isn't even really being carried out at the moment, they get rid of the handgun freeze and all this stuff, I could see in 15 years having concealed carry in certain parts of Canada, at least for certain people. Because the liberals have put themselves in such a vulnerable, precarious position on that issue, the conservatives can easily win the first few battles, and that gives them massive momentum going towards getting something like more of a strong right to own a gun in Canada. And it's because the liberals have overstepped. And this is generally why you don't want to overstep. So getting back to the United States, this is why Lindsey Graham was not wrong. And spoiler alert, or I guess not really spoiler alert, but not to offend people more on the populist right, but Lindsey Graham is my absolute favorite senator. But he did not hurt the Republicans in that election because the Democrats were in such a precarious position. He could have proposed pretty much anything outside of an outright abortion ban, and he wouldn't have alienated a single voter. It was only the commentariat who thought he alienated voters because they're too inside their own heads.
A lot of the commentariat, especially online, tend to be this dissident right, and some of them aren't even right wing. Like, for example, like the Tim Pools of the world, who are not actually right wing. They don't like Lindsey Graham because they don't like that, quote unquote, he's a warmonger. So, of course, anything he does has to be a bad and trying to hurt the party because the quote unquote con establishment is just bad. But they're not actually conservatives, so of course they don't agree with the conservative thing.
Even Ben Shapiro thought it was a bad move at the time, and he still would cite it as a bad move. But I think that the problem is when you're in the bubble of the commentariat, you tend to huff a lot of conventional wisdom that everyone around you says, that if you bring it up, it's bad for us, because I've heard people say that the pro-life issue is bad for us. Okay, is it really? Because the 2022 midterm election was really not highlighted with a lot of life issues as the ballot box issue.
This is an issue we actually see time and again, more broadly with commentary on elections. And this is like the most hubristic thing I'm going to say, but most people talking about elections have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. They have zero clue.
And to qualify it between the two of us, and that you're saying, well, you guys talk about elections all the time and how politics actually works. the difference between us and other people, when other people talk about how politics actually works, it's usually this kind of trying to sound super hardcore and populisty, and oh, I'm going to tell you the secret about how politics works. We're telling you, one, we actually have experience talking to people at the doors, even in much more suburban, sensitive parts of Canada, where if these issues were really big, we'd hear about them all the time. It's that most voters are very boring with their opinions, and they do not follow the news in this very hot-blooded way that you think that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And so oftentimes the way politics actually works is far more boring than you think. People care about the issues they care about, and no matter how much the media says that people shouldn't be caring about, reproductive rights this election, most people don't. Same thing in Canada. That's why the Liberals cannot gain any momentum. Doesn't matter how much the legacy media says people are going to be turned off by Pierre Poilievre's attacks on the media, which they're not attacks, he's just pushing back against bad questions, or that some of his MPs are too pro-life and all this stuff. We have not seen a single bit of movement in the polls because of anything Arnold Viersen has said. If anything, Arnold Viersen staying in caucus probably means a lot more people who were pro-life PPCers are more likely to move over because, oh goodness, I really like Arnold Viersen and he's a conservative. But nobody from the moderate middle, quote unquote moderate middle, is moving over to the Liberals because of any of these issues, because they're not issues, they're not election deciding issues for most people.
Because what ends up happening, and why a lot of commentators are just completely bad at this, is they look at this from the idea of conventional wisdom or whatever. And that's usually not right. Because just because it's conventional wisdom doesn't mean it's correct. Because these people who are using conventional wisdom are time and again
out my mic there.
Sorry?
Sorry, I knocked out my mic there in case I just randomly was cut off from talking.
Oh. And the difference here, at least I can't speak for Wyatt himself, but for myself, I have an entire framework in political theory that I am working off of that seems to be correct based off of real life evidence. And I'm making predictions and statements based off of actual theory. I haven't written down yet, but one day it will. A lot of people are just going, oh, this is conventional wisdom. This is how it is. And it's like, okay, but why is it like that? Do you have any reason to believe that? Do you have an argument, a theory as to why this is happening? No. They don't. They're just saying things that are repeated a lot. And it's like
my least favorite thing on this planet is somebody with conventional wisdom saying they have some study or whatever to back it up. And this is a great example, is the progressive left in the United States saying that Medicare for All is extremely popular because we got a poll back that says that Medicare for All is extremely popular. And it's like, that is an assumption backed up by bad polling that you've never actually tried in the battlefield. Try it out. Bernie Sanders got clobbered in 2016 and 2020 on a Medicare for All platform. People don't like it, and that was a Democratic primary.
Well, a good example of this, I know a guy. He works for the California Democrat Party in policymaking, and he's told me he's told me with conviction that no one in the California Democrat Party who actually has any political power will ever tolerate anyone talking about Medicare for All. No one wants it who has power. No one wants who has influence.
And it's not for the reasons that progressives will say that they won't do it. Oh, they're controlled by big pharma or whatever, the private insurance companies. It's because the Republicans would win the next state election if they did that. It's because most people like their plans. The actual amount of uninsured people in the United States who don't have private plans, Medicare or Medicaid, is 3 million people. Basically 1% of people. It's not hard to get insured in the United States. You would actually be paying less per year for your private medical insurance plan than you would be paying for the proportion of your taxes in Canada that goes towards healthcare. It's not an issue that people want a giant giant overhaul on in policy.
And the thing with that, worth noting too, especially on Medicare for All in the U.S., in general, voters don't like rocking the boat Like, this is a general thing. They don't want things to change very fast or drastically. This is why you should do incremental policy changes. Like, you don't want to go, let's say, on guns in Canada. You don't want to go from a licensing system to a full free-for-all U.S.-style Second Amendment. That people will be like, whoa, that's way too fast. You can't do that.
Yeah, like if Polyev ran on like a 16-week abortion ban, that would kill him in Canada. Or maybe not, because the economy's so bad, people would vote conservative no matter what you do. But like that might not be popular and that would hurt him in Canada if he said 16-week ban. But if he just said we're just going to defund foreign abortions again and ban sex selective, he'd actually probably go up in the polls, because people don't see that as rocking the boat. If anything, that sounds extremely sensible to the average person's ears.
And so, like, in the U.S., Medicare for All, that's a huge rock in the boat. You're telling people you're gonna get rid of all the doctors, the whole system, how it works. Everything you know about the healthcare system is gonna be gone and changed. And people are like, oh, but I like the healthcare system. It's just too expensive.
You know Kyle Kalinske?
No, not off the top of my head.
Every time I think of the Medicare issue, I always think about his quote that politics is an easy game that we make complicated. And he said that right before he talked about how even most Republicans are in favor of Medicare for all if you ask them, which is stupid, because if you ask people, do you think Medicare for all is a good idea? Most people will say yes, because that poll question isn't explaining how it works. And in an election cycle, it will be explained how it works. If Medicare for all was so popular, why are Donald Trump and the Republicans running really hard against Kamala Harris on her being in favor of banning private insurance in favor of Medicare for all back in 2019, and now Kamala Harris is running away from that policy proposal, that policy musing she had back in that cycle? Because it's not popular. It's not because she just hasn't seen the polling and that everyone just hasn't seen it, and we're all being hoodwinked or whatever by, whatever Noam Chomsky calls, what is it, like manufactured consent?
Mm-hmm.
No, it's because it's actually not popular. And that's the funny thing. In a certain sense, Kyle Kalinske is correct that politics is an easy game that we make complicated. But it's an easy game in the sense that just put yourself in the actual frame of mind of a middle-class person who wants a few basic things out of life, and it's not hot-blooded political battles. And you can pretty easily figure out what most people want, no matter what region you're in.
A good rule of thumb to have when you're looking at policy, you're looking at politics, you're looking at political parties, is when they have power, the things that they don't do are usually not because they're greedy or they're evil or they're trying to keep that policy there to fundraise off of. If there's a thing, well, let's go with abortion. People in the U.S., Democrats, are like, why didn't Obama with his supermajority in 2008 codify Roe? He didn't codify Roe because that would have lost him, destroyed the Democrats for the next cycle. That's why he didn't do it.
Well,
it was a
lost
political
the presidency loser. Because after 2010 he lost his majority and never got back.
Yeah, it would have. If he rammed that through in 2009, that probably would have destroyed his presidency. He might have lost 2012 because of that. And that's why he didn't do it. He didn't not do it because, we can fundraise off of this. No, the politicians, for the most part, do the things that their constituents want, for the most part. And when they don't, it's usually because it's not politically possible. Like, why didn't Harper restrict abortions in Canada in 2011? Because it wasn't politically viable. The pro-life movement in Canada had not done the groundwork necessary to do that. And that's how it works out. Like, if a policy doesn't happen, when your party has a trifecta, or a full government, or whatever you want to call it, whatever your system makes the full control government called, it's usually because it's not politically possible. Or there's so much political capital involved, it's not worth it. In Canadian terms, Trudeau right now, maybe not right now because it might be hard with the NDP, but in 2015, Trudeau could have rammed through his preferred electoral reform, which was to have ranked choice ballots, because the ranked choice ballots, in principle, should favor the Liberal Party quite a lot. he couldn't do it. Why couldn't he do it? He wanted to do it. The Liberal Party wanted to do it. Why didn't he do it? Because it would have been really bad. He would have got destroyed in the next cycle because it would have looked like he was just changing the rules to benefit him because there was no buy-in from anyone else. He couldn't do it. Even with a supermajority. And that's the important thing you need to keep in mind when you're talking about actually exercising political power. Having majority doesn't give you an actual capacity to do whatever you want, unless you genuinely don't care about winning the next election. But
yeah, it gives you the whatever you want to do for maximum 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And, life is longer than 4 years if you've ever, gotten past preschool.
Yeah. And if you do something too radical, too fast, too big, then it's going to get undone. And in fact, in the U.S., Obamacare almost got undone and really was only saved because Trump managed to piss off John McCain that much.
I wouldn't even blame Trump for that. I think that McCain is a heat-seeking missile who is always looking to be dissatisfied. Because even before Trump was in the Republican Party, he was like kind of one of those weird individuals had a fetish for being bipartisan, even when it made no sense to be. He was like a very strange person where he was very technically more Republican on social issues, but on fiscal issues, he's actually basically a Democrat.
Good point.
It's just there's a reason why they say that there is a specific McCain Republican type voter in Arizona, which tends to be women over the age of 55 who are like very kind of center left Republican voters, but who have that more, like, I guess, I'm not even sure what you'd call it, kind of keeping up with the Joneses type personality. You know what I mean? Country club Republicans. Country club Republican women specifically are John McCain Republicans. But I just want to quickly jump over to... Actually, I just want to mention just something about J.D. Vance I was thinking about earlier. The funny thing is when Trump picked him as his VP, and I still think this, he is a bad VP pick. But that concern I have has been fully nullified by the fact that Kamala Harris picked Tim Walz, who, in a certain sense, you absolutely want J.D. Vance if Kamala Harris's VP is Tim Walz, because that is a VP debate that could actually shift votes, especially with all the vulnerabilities that Tim Walz has with just lying all the time. Whereas before, I far preferred Doug Burgum for Donald Trump, but that was because previously they were up against Joe Biden. And now, this allows me to transition to another topic. I actually think that Joe Biden probably would perform better still than Kamala Harris.
Ooh, that's a bold take.
And it's because just the incumbent advantage of being somebody with 100% name recognition with Joe Biden well overcomes Kamala Harris being kind of like a fresh face for the ticket, but who has then radical policies and not 100% of Americans know who she is.
Well, there is a reason.
People vote for people who they know, and that's the problem for a lot of small parties in Canada, is that people don't know who they are, so they can't even consider voting for them.
This is rumors, disclaimer, but there's rumors back to when Harris was being picked that Obama and Pelosi, it was never established who they wanted, but they wanted to pick someone else at convention, and Biden was angry that he got pushed out, and he endorsed Kamala just to be a final middle finger to Obama and Pelosi for pushing him out. And then the further extension of these rumors is that Pelosi pushed Kamala to pick Tim Walz over someone like Josh Shapiro or something else because she doesn't think they can win, so that she doesn't want to burn a good candidate on the VP slot. She wants to
That was
burn.
such an own goal picking Tim Walz over Josh Shapiro, because that would have really made JD Vance a bad VP pick, is having him up on a VP debate stage with Josh Shapiro, or just in people's minds as the VP choices. Josh Shapiro as a Democrat, even though very much I would disagree with a lot of his policy prescriptions on many issues. He's a moderate feeling Democratic VP pick, whereas JD Vance feels like a radical Republican VP pick, even though in a lot of ways actually JD Vance is very much a Democrat Republican. He's pro protectionism in like a way that you wouldn't hear from anybody but like some union boss in the 70s who's a voting Democrat. But by picking Tim Walz, it completely nullifies a lot of the issues with JD Vance, because Tim Walz is a man with different but similar problems.
Mm-hmm. And someone like Josh Shapiro does have a lot of credibility he can point to, because he can, on like modern appeal, because he can, in Pennsylvania, he is backing things like school choice, which is a very big winning policy for a lot of suburban moms, which is a demographic that both parties want to win. And it's one of those issues that is really plays well with suburban moms, because as we touched on early in the podcast, what do suburban moms really concern about? The education of their kids. And school choice gives them full flexibility on how their kids are being educated without having to pay out of pocket.
And can we just mention the fact that right now most people ballparking this election say that whoever wins Pennsylvania is 90% likely to win, and you didn't pick the governor of Pennsylvania to be your VP. You picked a guy from Minnesota, and Minnesota is a really weird state for a lot of reasons. I'm currently finishing up a book called Electing Jesse Ventura, a man who at one point was the governor of Minnesota. Minnesota likes to vote in unique fashions, in the sense that they actually say it's kind of a character of Minnesota. Minnesota likes to vote in such a way that you don't expect. There's a reason. Do you actually know that there's no Democratic Party in Minnesota?
I do.
Yes, it's the DFL. It's the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Back when the Democratic Party and the Farmer Labor Party merged, the Farmer Labor Party was the far bigger party. It is a state that elects Democratic Socialists back in the 1930s, and of course elects the Reform Governor Jesse Ventura in the 90s. That it's one of those states where I don't feel like it likes being nailed down and feeling like it's understood and bought, in a certain sense, like, oh, it's the Democratic state. As soon as you imply it's a Democratic state and I'm picking Tim Walz to make sure I have Minnesota held down, I actually think probably Kamala Harris threw down a gauntlet and challenged Minnesota to do something different.
Mm.
And also, I don't think Tim Walz is actually nearly as popular of a governor as you think. Governors on the back nine of their tenures tend to have a little bit of that sunsetting feel. It's the twilight years of the governorship. Let's all have nice feelings about it. As soon as they're like, oh, he could be your VP too. It's like if you picked Oprah, or when they picked Mehmet Oz as the Republican Senate nominee in Pennsylvania. As soon as a celebrity goes into politics, their approval ratings and everything hit the floor because all of their problems come out of the closet. Tim Walz, a lot of people maybe could have forgiven him for some of the problems back in 2020, but as soon as you renominate him in a different position, a lot of people in Minnesota are probably going to strongly chafe against that, because they thought he was just going to ride into the sunset and leave them alone.
That's one thing that's worth noting too, that you see in the US that you don't see in Canada, because most governors are term limited to some level. Or at least by convention, they're term limited, because some of them aren't actually legally term limited. They just, no one ever runs 3 terms in a row. Because you have this expectation that no one's going to run for a 3rd term, by the time you're in your 2nd term, as you were touching on there, people are like, why should we be mad at this guy? Like, he's going to be gone in 2 years. We don't have to worry about him again. It's the same thing why you see polling in, like, Russia right now. And Putin is, like, super popular. And this is done by Western companies using Western methods, so it's probably not fudged. And it makes sense if you think about it, because if you're a Russian voter, you can't get rid of Putin. So, like,
Yeah, and nobody's exactly starving. Like, obviously, I think Putin's a horrible person, but like, nobody's starving. You know, at least you can kind of claim that there's some national pride stuff around him taking it to the Ukrainians or something stupid like that. But like, yeah, you like, also the guy like apparently has Parkinson's. You're not expecting that he's going to be around for 3 years, uh, or he's going to like step down or something like that. So yeah, like a lot of people will have good feelings towards something that they don't really like. But that was it's almost the reverse of Kamala Harris becoming the nominee. As soon as she's the nominee, a lot of Democrats have to pretend that they now like her, even though when she's vice president, you can be more honest because you don't expect that she's ever actually going to be in a position of power. So she had like 34% approval ratings. And now, as soon as she's the Democratic nominee, she jumps up to having like 40% approval ratings or like 42%.
But this is why
Nobody actually likes her, but now I'm going to vote for her. So I'm not going to be the idiot who's voting for somebody I don't even like.
this is that's one of the things. Why approval ratings, I think, are like one of the most useless statistics that polls ask and people seem to care about. Is they're lagging indicators because, in general terms, no one is going to dislike the person that they are committing to voting for, because that's an irrational thing to do. It feels wrong to be like, I hate this guy, I'm going to vote for him. So very few people will do that. There's some people who have the ability to have this like cognitive dissonance in their head.
Well, that happened with Clinton and Trump in 2016. If you ask Democrats if they like Clinton, everyone would say yes. If you ask people if they like Trump, everyone would say yes for Republicans. But if you ask people the question, do you think would you have liked a better option on both sides? A vague question. Everyone would be like, yeah, I wish we had a better option.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's the cognitive dissonance that you don't want to admit that you're voting for somebody that you dislike. And actually, that was, again, why it would have been smart to have Josh Shapiro as the Democratic VP pick. Like, I'm happy they don't because it gives Kamala Harris a better chance of losing. But the thing is, in a state like Pennsylvania, a state that is far closer in the governor races than Minnesota is. Minnesota is a little bit more of a default Democratic state. That means Josh Shapiro's pretty much had every single skeleton already ripped out of the closet because he was in a tight race. Not really that tight because Doug Mastriano was a terrible Republican nominee. But overall, the Republicans feel like they can win that state, so they will attack Josh Shapiro with any angle they have. When Tim Walz is running, you kind of expect the Democrat to win, so they're not going to go that ham at Tim Walz. So Tim Walz actually had like a dozen skeletons in his closet that went completely not investigated because it didn't really matter, because even if you hit him really hard in a governor's race, you're still probably not going to be able to beat him.
Mm-hmm.
Where like your opponents actually do your best vetting for you. And so Shapiro was fully vetted, Walz was not.
And because another thing on top of that, because for example,
sorry, just to quickly cut in one more time, but even JD Vance, they're trying to do the whole weird thing with him. If in a certain sense, he's already fully defined as a person because they thought they could beat him in Ohio for the Senate. So there's no more scandals you can pull on JD Vance other than just calling him weird for out of context stories
or taking high school photos of him and publishing them.
Yeah, because apparently, the guy once played Halo 2 at his friend's house back in 2005. You should be deeply scared.
There was one photo they released of him that was like, it was him in like a boy's bathroom with like 4 girls pretending to use the urinals, and it's like, aha! And it's like, I don't know what you're trying to say with this by publishing this. Like, what? He had friends who were girls in high school? Oh no.
Yeah, and people messed around at high school because that's high school.
Like, what? But the other thing worth noting with this too is, on Wyatt's point, like 2022, Shapiro and Walz were up for nominal election. They both won their elections in 2022. No one paid attention to Minnesota in 2022. It was not on the radar. Pennsylvania was front and center. It was a state that everyone was talking about because Republicans were hoping to try to win both the Senate and the governor. Now, they nominated 2 bad candidates, but, the GOP has skill issues, often. But they had hope, even with 2 bad candidates, to win both of those races. So Pennsylvania was front and center public nationally. They had all the interesting controversies around Fetterman for the stroke at the time. So everyone saw Shapiro. It was public. It was the main national story. No one paid attention to walls. And frankly, outside of even in Minnesota, how many people paid attention to walls? If you're from Minnesota, you can comment below and say, well, I paid attention to walls so much. He's like the greatest.
And the thing with walls, and this is again one of those things where it's not really conventional wisdom, but I think if you like watch politics long enough, you can look at a candidate and immediately see what their skills are. Not in like this kind of esoteric way, like, or not esoteric, but Gnostic way, like I can see what this guy's all about by just looking at him. But if you look at this person's style for just a little bit, you can kind of tell how they might perform. Tim Walz, when I look at the guy, I just think the word flatulence, bloated flatulence, when I look at his style, in the sense that exposed to the general public for long enough, I think people get sick of him. Where Josh Shapiro, I look at him and I immediately think of the words like professional and slick. Even if I disagree with him on policy, he looks professional and slick. And those things can sometimes be bad. I would say Mitt Romney is too slick in a certain sense. You know what I mean? Mitt Romney comes off kind of greasy in how kind of a slick businessman type of feel he has. And when you look for a nanosecond, Tim Walz looks fatherly and like his previous role as a coach. But as you keep going, it's kind of like the uncle you want to go back home. I mean, he's like, he's drank too much and he has to leave the house. Whereas Josh Shapiro seems like somebody you'd be friends with. I mean, he looks like a work buddy.
I've wanted to do this for a while, but I don't know how to do this now because I have my YouTube channel is going to attract people who actually pay attention to politics. But I've had a study idea of what I wanted to do for ages. Maybe one day I'll do it with funding. That one of the main driving factors in a vote is if someone's appearance and their vibe fit certain archetypes. I think I mentioned on a previous podcast before with you, actually. But anyways, one of the theses is that one of the most effective archetypes of the male politician is the helpful dad. Like the John Horgans of the world, if you know who that is.
Of course, I'm in BC.
I won't mention the viewer. But yeah, and it's like...
Former Premier PC, for people wondering.
And you look at someone like Tim Walz, he doesn't fit that. Like, he doesn't look handy. He doesn't look like someone who can help you, like...
Well, I think kooky neighbor.
Yeah.
He would literally be in central casting that I want a kooky neighbor for Dennis the Menace.
And, like, at a certain level, if you talk about this stuff to people, a certain segment of the population will get really annoyed because they don't like the idea that you're judging people by their looks. And that's why I couldn't actually get the study done the first time I wanted to do it in university, because everyone I asked didn't want to fill out the survey. Feels bad.
Hey, but with politics, it's so much different than, like, casting for a Hollywood movie. This sounds weird and cruel, but being ugly helps in politics often because people never forget your face. The biggest mistake Ted Cruz ever made was growing a beard. Ted Cruz looks weirder without the beard, but you never forget what he looks like. And that's better than being, like, if you're hyper attractive, like, I would say Gavin Newsom or Josh Hawley are, like, two male politicians who are attractive enough that attractiveness is good. There are other guys who they look just good enough that they're just boring. I mean, Scott Walker is a guy I cannot remember what he looks like. Josh Hawley there, he looks almost kind of JFK-ish. Scott Walker looks like a person. Like, I have just told you to auto-generate a person. You know what I mean?
I see what you mean, yeah. That's
even Josh Shapiro is a little Scott Walker-ish, but on a VP ticket, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Even he looks a little bit more iconic than Scott Walker does.
That's actually one of the reasons, a related reason why I thought back in the pandemic when Trudeau grew out his beard, that was not a good choice, because...
Maybe pull up on screen Ted Cruz with and without his beard.
Yes.
I just want people to know what my point is.
Ted Cruz beard. This is what he looks like with a beard?
For all you wondering. You're not actually wondering. I'm actually forcing you to look this up.
I can't believe that Google search worked. What?
Oh, it goes back to the same thing. Anyways, but yeah, he almost, even that's not the best thing because he's angling his face a little bit. Genuinely, he looks kind of a little bit, and I like Ted Cruz. I like Ted Cruz. He's from my home city of Calgary. But he looks a little bit goblinish without it. He has a very kind of pointed, bulbous nose at the end. You know, I mean, you look at him and you wouldn't forget what he looks like. He looks like central casting for a southern lawyer in Louisiana. Now, I don't want to overstate my case. I might just be a simple lawyer down from Savannah. But is it true or is it not true that Ted Cruz looks better without a beard? He just kind of looks more generic with a beard, you know what I mean?
He definitely looks more generic with a beard. And
Here's my thing. Pierre Poilievre, better with glasses, actually. I still stand by Pierre Poilievre's better with glasses. I think he took the glasses off because it generated a bunch of news stories out of nowhere because people are like, oh my goodness, he took his glasses off. But Pierre Poilievre, I find, looked more iconic with the glasses. And that's the thing in politics. You don't want to look good unless being attractive makes you look super iconic. In terms of, like, Gavin Newsom almost looks like a Ken doll a little bit, and that kind of helps him. But, like, you want to look iconic. And if you're so attractive, that kind of makes you a little iconic. If you're ugly, that makes you iconic. Be that thing. Richard Nixon and JFK are two politicians who are on the sort of opposite end of the spectrum. Richard Nixon would not do as well if he wasn't as jowly looking of a person. Know what I mean? JFK minus 5% attractiveness points, terrible. I mean, never going to win the presidency.
Okay, let's see if I can get a full... I hate it when
this is going to be a clipped segment in this podcast because us just talking about the attractiveness of different male politicians.
Here we go. So this is my point on Trudeau here. So when Trudeau, one of his main selling points, the longest time, is that he's young, energetic, new. And then when he grew out this beard during COVID, it ages him so much. Like, this is an older photo than this one, and he looks younger in this photo. This is from 2023. This is, like, I think 2020, yeah. Like, the beard ages him a lot. It was not the right choice.
Oh, he went from, handsome male politician to, like, ski instructor. Older ski instructor.
Yep.
Which I think Trudeau literally was at one point in his life.
He was, but he was young at the time, so he wouldn't be the aged ski instructor. He was the young whippersnapper.
Thank you for using the word whippersnapper.
It's a great word. It's fun. Recommend it.
Actually, because I'm in BC, you can go look up John Horgan and then go look up David Eby, because I think this is actually a big point against David Eby. I once said that he looks like Gumby plus a vulture in terms of his posture. Posture matters also, by the way. We are tactically avoiding talking about female politicians' looks.
Yes, that is not an accident. This is not a good picture of Eby.
Also, I just don't have as many good examples.
This is a terrible picture of Eby.
I'm not even trying to be rude. All of them are bad. All of them are bad.
I need to get a... Let's see if we can get
the problem. Look at his posture. I have terrible photos of his posture, and it's just all these photos of him walking. Look at them. Look at them. Look at that one on the right. Right? Yeah, that one. What is this? He's just always looks like he's like a question mark. He's a walking question mark with his posture. And the problem is he's super tall. Every time he's standing next to somebody and he's doing a selfie video, he looks like he's going to peck the person's eyes out. Because he's always looking down at them at a very severe angle. Because he's genuinely 6'5". And when he's talking to a woman who's average height 5'6", he looks like he's an emu staring at her in the videos.
EB is one of those guys who I don't think this is a general useful thing for a politician. Like, and by useful I mean like I don't think it generally provides an advantage or not. But EB's one of those guys where hitting the gym real hard, like going hard on the pre-workout, getting the creatine in there, like really bulk up real big. It would fill out his frame, and he would look. It would make him look smaller.
He looks like right now Gabe from The Office.
As if
in
you're
that kind of Poindextery way that's not good. There is a type of politician, by looking kind of like a dork, it helps. But with him, he just kind of looks like, I don't even know what to say, like just accountant in the second basement floor of a company.
And
he looks unsubstantial. That's actually what helps with John Rusted running against him for John Rusted. John Rusted looks like just an adult compared to David Eby. Just like an older guy that you know who's mowing his lawn down the street. I think John Rusted's like 64 or something like that. So he's like a little bit older. But, you know, I mean, he looks like an actual adult compared to David Eby, who looks like he's wearing his dad's suit.
And that's where one of the things, you see this line, people say it frequently, it's like, oh, being really tall is an advantage.
Not this tall. Not lanky.
You don't want to be lanky. So, like, that's why Eby would be greatly helped by just hitting the gym real hard. Because when you bulk up and you get bigger arms, bigger whatever, right? It makes you look shorter. Because you look more proportional.
Because the thing is that, and this is why actually if you're tall, don't wear too many vertical stripes because it makes you look even taller. You actually want some horizontal stripes. And if you're a bit of a fat guy, don't wear horizontal stripes. So Chris Christie needs vertical stripes. David Eby needs horizontal stripes. Mm-hmm. Actually, again, Chris Christie, great example of a guy that once you see his face, you never forget him.
Nor do you forget his name.
What?
Nor do you forget his name.
Yeah, nor do you forget his name. Having a good name helps.
Though that's a lot harder to work with. You can't really pick your name.
Yeah. Unless you're a woman, then you get married.
True, but your choices are still pretty limited there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is just an interesting thing here. Like, I don't have a good... I only have vibe on this. I don't have, like, a concrete theory that I could write down on this, but the core summary of this is your appearance matters, and how you present yourself matters. It definitely affects...
It doesn't matter, like, rolling the dice, oh, you were born wrong kind of a thing. It's work to your advantages.
I actually touched on this a little tiny bit when I was talking about the UK election very briefly. And it wasn't so much on their actual appearance, but just how they presented themselves, Starmer versus Sunak versus Farage. And you have to make sure that the way you're presenting yourself as a person, how you articulate your policies, how your demeanor is, actually works with who you are as a person and how you act. For example, in that case, Sunak is the kind of middle class... He's not middle class, but he acts like a middle class finance guy. But he was trying, like he actually is the personality of a middle class finance guy, but he was trying to act as the aloof, reserved, aristocratic statesman. It's like he's just not that person. It looks really fake. Everyone knows that's not who he is.
He looks like he looks like an accountant when you look at the guy. And honestly, him actually being Indian helps, just because the last name and just the fact he's brown adds at least a little interest to it, because he's not like who is the prime minister right after Margaret Thatcher?
I don't know, which is an indication in and of itself.
I mean, like the conservative right after, which is an indication right over itself. What's his name? But yeah, if he was just a white guy kind of accountant looking
John Major.
John Majors, there you go. If he even like John Major is not like a lanky, thin, young-looking accountant guy. He's an older, fatter version of that. But again, it's like he in a bad way fits the stereotype of a square Tory politician, and that was Rishi Sunak's problem too. Was that he was a square, indecisive Tory politician. even just in the way he looked. He looks like somebody in his very kind of thin, lanky state. Looks like somebody probably a little scared of life. I mean, scared of the cameras a little bit.
And
Where Keir Starmer, I wouldn't say Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer basically won by default, but Keir Starmer at least was advantaged by he kind of is just a guy, and that's all they needed.
And Keir Starmer actually did lean into what his personality and vibe looks like, because he, as a person, in interviews, in debates, in speeches, he acts as he is the acting of the aloof aristocrat kind of guy who's just kind of like off to the sidelines, like looking from afar, looking down at all the people.
But if you actually swapped it, and it's not that, I don't think it would have been default a Keir, or not Keir, it wouldn't have been a default Labour victory, no matter who was the leader. I think if Jeremy Corbyn was still the leader, I think it would have probably been a minority Labour victory in which it would have probably been another snap election by now, because Corbyn looks like a communist when you look at him. Like, I'm imagining what a British communist looks like. A British communist looks like Jeremy Corbyn in my mind. Part of that's because Jeremy Corbyn has shaped the image of what a British communist looks like. But scruffy, neckbeard looking,
I never realized how
trade unionist.
I never realized
Look at
how
that
crooked his
collar
glasses.
gap in his official photo. What the heck? Look at that.
Look how crooked his glasses are on his face.
Yeah. Men out there, make sure that when you buy a suit jacket, it actually form fits to the back of your shirt. You don't have that giant gap that I could park a semi-truck in.
Also, make sure your glasses fit.
Yeah.
Your glasses should not be, like, your eyes should not be
looking like you have diphtheria.
Yeah. If your ears are lopsided, you should get frames that counterbalance that so they fit on your face properly.
Actually, this is, again, and we're just basically going through every single politician's appearance now. Nigel Farage looks actually just like, when you look at him, you just kind of, he seems like a fun guy when you look at him. And that's what actually really helps soften the kind of attacks that Reform gets as a far-right party. It's very much not a far-right party. But Nigel Farage's general vibe tends to soften that. Because every photo you get of Nigel Farage is laughing. I mean...
Well, I mean,
you imagine him smiling when you think of him in your mind.
Just in
so this is where appearance stuff is actually... a lot of your image as an appearance is in a lot of ways up to you. When I think of Kamala Harris, I always picture her in a still frame laughing. Whether it's something that would turn somebody off, because I always imagine her kind of cackling a little bit in a way that's kind of weird. Other people might not, but that's kind of the image you have. Really wrinkly looking laugh.
And it's also...
Biden has a more of a stalwart look, which really does help him. He looks moderate. And to bring up somebody, and I actually like him a lot, but JJ McCullough in Canada, if you guys watch JJ McCullough's channel, I consider him an aesthetic moderate. Because he liked Joe Biden and Kamala Harris over Donald Trump, because he doesn't like that Donald Trump looks weird. And Donald Trump definitely looks weird. Now let's bring up a photo of JJ McCullough. You guys should go subscribe to his channel. He has a good YouTube channel. But JJ McCullough, I say he's an aesthetic moderate because he's a Canadian conservative, but he really hates Donald Trump. And JJ is almost like a first round draft pick who would vote for someone like Biden, because Biden seems like a moderate older man, whereas Donald Trump seems like a very chaotic individual. Also, Donald Trump, if Donald Trump doesn't look like Donald Trump, he doesn't do nearly as well. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
If Donald Trump looks like Trump Jr., he loses.
Well, if Donald Trump isn't like a very tall, overweight dude with a bad spray tan, who is he? And a weird toupee.
He needs to look the way that his acting does, or it doesn't work. If he doesn't have that kind of a line around his face where you can tell where the tan ends and his normal just skin tone begins, he's not actually as popular, as weird as it is. And that's my impression. He would get less votes.
That's the important thing to know with this, too, is we're not saying that, if you look this way, you get more votes. It's the way you look has to jive with how you act in a constructive way. So if you act like Trump, you act like he's aloof, he's kind of a funny dude. He's a larger than life personality, literally. Looking a little fake because of the weird spray tan, the weird toupee.
Looks like the most kind of, when I say sweaty, I don't mean even in a negative way, but just viscerally Hollywood person you've ever seen in your life.
Mm-hmm.
He looks Hollywood in a New Yorker sense.
Yeah.
I can smell the 70s real estate market on him.
That cheese carpet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that, like, and that's where, yeah, you're right. You have to kind of lean in to what your appeal is. Do you know the term brown shoe?
No.
It's a term that refers to the way a lot of young Canadian conservative staffers dress. That makes them seem hopelessly square and desperate for acceptance. All these guys who show up to conservative conventions, usually in their 20s, wearing almost neonish bright blue suits and really clunky brown shoes. I'm dressing like a Tory, and they seem like staffers, and you're always going to seem like a staffer dressing that way. You seem desperate to be considered a conservative. I can see a brown shoe like across the hall, and I know it's like going to be like an Airedale personality conservative kid talking about how much he thinks, Aaron O'Toole's a great leader.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. And this is actually not even that uncontroversial because you think about it, like the business world back before business like standards of dress got really silly during like COVID and stuff. The rule of thumb was you should dress for the job you want. You should dress to impress. Haha. And part of that isn't just the clothes you're wearing. It's how you portray yourself. If you want to be management, you have to portray yourself as someone who could do management. If you portray yourself as someone who's chaotic or doesn't listen or whatever, no one's gonna want you to manage things. If you portray yourself as a politician as dishonest, people aren't going to trust you. And you look dishonest because the vibe that you give them and how you act and how you speak doesn't match with how you dress and how you look. Something looks fake. They don't know what's fake. They don't know if it's the dress or if it's how you act, but something looks fake and it feels wrong. And that's why you have to do. Not every politician can do the same strategy. What doesn't work for Jagmeet Singh works for Trudeau. If Trudeau was just a random middle class dude, he would not be successful. As successful. He is as successful as he is because he is from a rich, aloof family. And he leaned into that.
It has an automatic feeling of importance. Like, this person should be prime minister.
Mm-hmm. Whereas Singh kind of fails because Singh is in like a very similar socioeconomic class to Trudeau in all real meanings of the term, but Singh doesn't have the same upbringing that Trudeau has. But Singh is trying to act like Trudeau does, and it feels wrong because Singh doesn't have the personality or background that Trudeau has.
And it feels pretentious when you're leading a party like the New Democrats, who are supposed to be that kind of trade unionist labor party, like again, trying to find a good. I had an example in my head a second ago, but it's kind of like that. There's a lot of times where you actually do want kind of the hard scrabble politician, where if they actually did come from a rich family, they wouldn't do nearly as well. Like a Pierre Poilievre, if he came out of a rich family, and his family was worth tens of millions of dollars, would not do nearly as well as if he was adopted like he is. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's so weird, but it actually does help. Because it has that hero narrative, whereas Justin Trudeau has that kind of fit and finish, like, spit polished feeling of, high class and silverware. You know what I mean? Like, we're electing like a very high class politician right now.
Mm-hmm. And that's, again, the important thing is it's not how you dress, it's that or how you act. is that they have to work together, and they have to line up with who you are. Poilievre can dress and act in a certain way. He's very pugilistic in how he acts. And he dresses more business casual, in a sense, which kind of leans into that a bit, because he kind of looks like the middle management guy who's going to, like, or the lawyer who's going to, like, really hold your feet to the fire, right? He dresses kind of like that stereotype, and that's how he acts. He is going to hold your feet to the fire. Now, he probably act like... It's weird to talk about this because it's hard to put a concrete framing on this, but this is just how it is, right? You have to act like how you dress. You have to dress how you act. And it can't be an act. It has to be who you are. It's better to be you than pretending to be someone else. Like O'Toole pretending to be an arch blue Tory, quote unquote, doesn't work very well because he can't maintain that ruse because that's not who he was. Acting like a really tough guy, it's not really who O'Toole was. O'Toole is a much more soft-spoken dude. It's one of the reasons it didn't go as well. He tried to act too tough. Or versus, an easier example, 2019, Scheer tried to act real tough and real hard on Trudeau. And have you ever talked to Scheer or looked at Scheer? The guy's like the cheeriest
you
guy
literally
in the
only
room.
if I was creating a caricature of Scheer, I would basically just draw dimples.
He's like the cheeriest man alive. It's really hard to picture this man angry. Like, even his official photo here. Like, look at that. Look how happy this man looks.
It's not on screen, by the way.
What?
It's not on screen, by the way.
It's not? Huh.
Might be on the wrong window.
It is on the wrong window. That's awkward. One moment. Here we go. Okay, can we see it now? Or did I share the wrong screen again? I shared the wrong screen. 1 second. Technical difficulties. Here we go.
They've stayed with us this long.
Yeah. Okay, now you're seeing it on the screen. Look at this man. Look how happy he looks. This is his own official... This is the official photo.
That's his serious face.
Yeah. And then, like, look at Trudeau here. Trudeau... This is a Trudeau serious face, and he looks pretty serious. He looks like he's about to be like, you really disappointed.
Pleasantly serious.
He looks like a dad who's like, son, you shouldn't have done that. But is like also kind of like holding back laughter because he thought his son did something really funny, but like it wasn't appropriate. So you know, son, don't do that. But like it was kind of funny. Yeah, this is a very weird section of the video.
Yeah, I think we've ragged on politicians' looks enough. Next week we'll start criticizing the looks of female politicians.
That'll go great. I can see the comment section right now. How dare you say this about this person? That's rude. Oh. Well, I think it's a good time to wrap it up. It's getting late.
Yeah, I think we started this like almost 3 hours ago.
Yeah, we're at like 2.5 in.
Wow.
Okay, well, we're gonna wrap this up here. Just cold close this. So if you liked the video, like, share, subscribe, comment below. I don't know if anyone's ever gonna hear this pitch right here at 2 hours and 23 minutes, but you know.
If you do, you better become a member of Bagel's channel.
If you're not a member of my channel already, I'm impressed.
Goodness, look at all the content you're getting out of this. You've just gone through almost 3 hours, and you're still with us. So obviously, you want to support this man.
Yeah, join the channel. Anyways, with that, we bid you all adieu, and we'll see you some other time. Bye.